Welcome once again. This is kind of the beginning of our actual uh, planning grant curriculum where we take time each webinar to dive into a new topic matter. My name is Robin Harris. I'm getting to know everyone at this point. Thank you for being here. If you have access to the webinar functions, feel free to use that closed caption if you'd like. The chat box, I will try to watch for raised hands. It's also a fairly small planning grant cohort, so you're always welcome to talk over audio, interrupt us, we don't mind. And if you do have access, if you could please start signing in via the chat box with your organization, name, and if you'd like to participate in our icebreaker, what is your favorite winter food or beverage? And as well, I am putting in the chat our privacy and recording disclaimer that was read ahead of time for access for folks. So we'll let people continue to just kind of get settled and sign in while I go over a few additional slides. So if you've been with us at our initial orientation and or our fiscal orientation, you've probably seen this slide, and I promise I won't continue to have it every time. Just wanted to do one last shout out to the online resources that you have available. So we've got our planning grant meeting materials page. That is going to have all of the recordings and posting. It also has the future webinars. So if you ever lose track of your iCalendar, you can just hop on the website and get into the webinar that way too. Our additional resources is where you're going to find like some of the special terms and conditions related to your actual grant and delivery of that grant. And then our program handbook page, which is really for our operational grants, but it also is the basis for our planning grant year. And hopefully that handbook is something that you'll be reviewing in your off time. Thanks for those that are signing in and participating. Muddled cider and French onion soup. These are wonderful. Ooh, hot caramel apple cider. Absolutely. Okay, now I'm just hungry and thirsty. What you will continue to see as we learn together is an introductory slide on our learning to date. And that essentially is just going to show you kind of where we're at in the curriculum. What did we do last? What are we covering today? And what's up next? So again, hopefully you all have been locating, reviewing, and reading some of that more complex AmeriCorps guidance. You've had your initial program orientation and fiscal introduction. Like I said, today we're going to start with those deep dives on specific areas. Today, the theory of change as AmeriCorps perceives it, logic models, and supportive evidence for your theory of change. And then up next, we'll start looking at performance measures that enhance our theory of change and data collection and evaluation methods. Please note our next webinar is on a Wednesday. So most of your webinars are Thursday. We did have to move this one to accommodate our presenter. So make sure to mark your calendars and know that that is happening Wednesday, February 2nd. Full turkey dinner with all the fixing. Love it, Nate. Another thing that you'll be seeing kind of every time we get together is some questions to consider. And these are based kind of on a rotating basis of topics. These questions really do have to do with program design and that larger concept of an overall theory of change and all the pieces that go into theory of change and what you're going to learn about. Things that you'll want to think about that maybe we aren't going to prescribe. Maybe it isn't legislative, maybe it isn't around compliance. So these are questions that each organization is going to have to kind of wrestle with. And a lot of our one-on-one time can also be spent doing this. But these questions are going to be answered differently for each program. So as you listen today, you'll want to kind of think about not only the presentation and what's before you, but how are you fitting into that? Do you have clear alignment, clear design and dosage? And maybe you don't yet, and that's okay, but those are the steps you're going to work towards. Do you have evidence that supports your theory of change, such as the intervention and the overall alignment? How many AmeriCorps members are you thinking about? How many staff members are you thinking about? Those are all parts of specifically the logic model that really feeds our overall theory of change. With that, I am really happy to welcome Lou, who is our presenter for the day. And I believe Lou's going to do a little self-introduction, and then we will get on with our main presentation. It is a full presentation. We do expect to be together for the full 2 hours, and I believe we have a break in there at some point too. So welcome, Lou.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I'll come on camera just for a minute to say hello and introduce myself, and then I will go back off just to make sure that we can go through smoothly without any glitches. Um, Being rural, my internet is not always the best. So just wanted to say hi, and I'll be presenting. Like Robin said, it is a very packed uh full of content today and the webinar in 2 weeks as well on that Wednesday. I'll be presenting then, and it's just full of information. I want to tell you a little bit about my role. So I am the performance management analyst with Serve Washington. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns, and you will see me here and in the next presentation. And I'll also be there are different homework pieces that you might be submitting, and I'll help in the review of those and work with you related to theory of change, logic model, performance measures, all of those elements. And that is really where I focus my work with programs specifically, is those performance management areas, and do a lot of this sort of training and technical assistance, as well as just one-on-one support of our grantees in these specific areas. So I work together with the program officer team to give our programs the best support we can when it comes to evaluation, performance measures, and data collection. So I'm excited to get to know each of you and the programs that they're developing for AmeriCorps. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my camera and go into the presentation. So this really is a 3-part webinar where we are cramming in 3 separate webinars into one big one. So you can find the full webinars on the AmeriCorps online courses.litmus.com. You can see that there's a link on the screen, and there is you're all able to create an account. Maybe at the end, if we have a little time, we could pull up the website and kind of show you around a little bit, but basically you'll have to there is a contact, I think, email or a phone number that you can call about creating an account. But as planning grantees, you are able to do that, and then you can access all of these AmeriCorps courses in full. For today, I removed some of the slides just in the interest of time. And I've added a couple more, just hopefully to make it a little more engaging and increase participation and our ability to work together through some of the content. So let's get started. This is our first module. Starts with the theory of change, designing effective action for change. And in this, we will describe how a theory of change helps you to clarify the cause and effect relationship that's at the heart of your program. And I have a quick poll. I'm just kind of curious how familiar people are with this idea of a theory of change, if this is something you've worked with before, or maybe had to do in other grant applications. So Robin, do we have a poll item ready to go?
You know, Lou, I think that got lost in communication. My apologies. So
Okay.
maybe we can just have people put a number in the
Put
chat.
in the chat. Sure, absolutely. Um, yeah, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all familiar, this is new language, to 10 being I could do this in my sleep. I'm so familiar with what a theory of change is. All right, yeah, I'm seeing quite a range. Some of it is really new and unfamiliar, and for others it's quite familiar. All right, well that's helpful for me just to have an idea. Need a refresher. Yep. I I feel like every time I go through the information, I it's helpful in some new way. All right, so this module really, by the end of it, we're hoping that you'll be able to describe the benefits of having a theory of change and be able to define the three key elements that we're looking for whenever in the construction of a theory of change, and identify how the theory of change is going to inform your program design. So on the next slide, we see these are those three main elements. So first, there's the community problem or need that you are proposing to address. And then there's the specific intervention, which is the set of activities that you've chosen to address the need based on evidence that a similar approach has worked in the past. And then finally, there's the intended outcome. So if you deliver the intervention according to plan, you can be pretty confident that you'll bring about a measurable positive change in the community in relation to your targeted need. So as you develop a theory of change for an issue that your program will address, you identify where you are now, as well as the change for which you are programming, and you'll choose certain activities based on their link to your desired outcome. That we're going to dig into each of those elements in this presentation. Developing a theory of change requires you to kind of really spell out, like, what are those assumptions underlying your choice of activities. You'll be documenting why you think the activities will lead to the intended change. So there are some underlying elements to those three main elements, and that is the data that documents the extent and severity of the community need that you'll address. So that is part of the community problem need. And then there's also the evidence that informs your understanding of why a particular intervention will result in the change identified in the outcome. And the evidence is coming up in more detail towards the end of the presentation. We will have a whole module specifically about evidence. So if it's not really clear for a while what we mean by evidence, don't worry, more is coming. So here is just a really basic example of what a theory of change could look like in everyday life. And AmeriCorps chose this example from medicine because it is likely very familiar to all of us. So it can show us this pathway from problem to solution. So on the slide we have, if you have strep throat and your intended outcome is wellness, getting better, not having strep throat anymore, then taking antibiotics is a proven way to get there. But it gets a little more complicated because not every antibiotic is equally effective with strep throat. So you have to consider the evidence from past studies to determine the best possible intervention, or in this case, which antibiotics are best to fight strep. So penicillin has proven very effective in fighting strep when taken a certain number of times a day for a certain period of time, making it a good choice. Tetracycline is also a powerful antibiotic, but it hasn't shown effectiveness with strep throat. So you take 500 milligrams of penicillin twice a day for 10 days and you get well. So that's a theory of change in action. Now we can look at an example for a national service literacy tutoring program. Also, I want to insert real quick that if anyone, feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions. You can come off mute or type in the chat. I think Robin and I will just kind of keep an eye on the chat occasionally. So feel free to jump in anytime. So in this example of a literacy program, the community problem they identified is that third graders at the local elementary school are not reading at grade level. And they know this because there are high failure rates on the state reading exam. And this is supported, this they have data that documents the failure rates of the students, and they also have research that shows that it's really important to master reading by the end of the third grade for future academic success. And the intended outcome that's sought by this program is for students to be able to read at third grade level, as demonstrated by passing the state reading exam. So the intervention that they will provide is that they will provide individualized tutoring to students identified as not meeting reading benchmarks. And this tutoring will focus on 5 building block literacy skills through integrated reading, writing, and verbal communication activities. And they chose this because research has shown that this curriculum model is linked to demonstrable improvement in reading skills. The research outlines the specifics of the intervention that yielded the intended outcome. So the program is following what they found in previous research. So in your planning grant application, you are asked to describe the community need that your organization is hoping to address. And you were asked to provide information about the scope, significance, and cause of the problem in your communities or community wherever your organization is going to focus its efforts. And ideally, you would use reputable current and local data to demonstrate that. So let's go over this in a little more detail now. The community problem that we're talking about is the negative condition that exists. And the community need describes the extent and the severity of the problem in your community. For example, if a community has a number of teens who are overdosing on opioids, you would ask questions such as, what is the problem? What does the research say about the risks, about the impact of this? How extensive is the problem in the community? Are we talking 2% of teens, 5%, more? And what does this mean to our community? The description of the problem, as well as the specific community needs, should be supported by statistics, facts, and figures from current and reputable sources as much as possible. And as you read about and study the problem that you're wanting to address, the more you learn about it, the more you'll gain an understanding of it that should help you choose the best intervention. For example, in this case, like, do health classes cover this topic? Does the community offer, what kind of programs does the community offer, if any, in which teens could become involved? How is the problem described and analyzed in the literature and in conversations? What has been tried and whether or not it's worked or not, because that's useful to know what hasn't worked just as well as it is helpful to know what has worked. So let's talk a little about the statistics documenting the problem and need. So we're looking for data that's coming from reputable primary sources. So some examples of that would be like government agencies, institutes, foundations, and universities that have conducted their own research. So news reports are generally not primary data sources, and data from multiple sources can increase the reliability of your data. So you know that you're getting accurate information. And AmeriCorps also says that the data should be up to date, but there's really no hard and fast rule about like what counts as up to date. I know for research, I have seen them say that, generally like within the last 6 years or so is considered um, up to date, but use your best judgment. And if you can find more recent data, then go with the more recent data that you can find. And it also should be locally relevant. So if are you serving one county? Are you serving one specific school district? Or maybe an entire bioregion if you're an environmental program? um, National level and state level statistics don't tell us a whole lot about the program as it affects the community that where your intervention is going to be implemented. So we're really looking for data that is as specific to the area that you want to serve. And if you operate in multiple communities, be sure that your data describe all of the communities. Multi-site programs or programs covering really large geographic areas, maybe you do need to rely on countywide or even statewide data, but it needs to be clear why you selected particular communities for your intervention. And the goal really is to find and use data as close to the source as possible. So here are some common examples: census data, um, county health rankings, Environmental Protection Agency has some data. There are a couple others listed on the slide. I'm curious, I know every program with your unique focus area and intervention, maybe you have some like really cool, unique data sources. And if you are, I would be interested to see in the chat any of like your top go-to sources for data. And it could be some that are listed on the slide already. That's fine. Um, just curious if people have some sources to share and maybe give others some ideas of where to go. All right. It looks like maybe our slide has some of the main ones. All right, we can move on, but if you think of any, feel free to drop those in the chat. So the data describing the community problem/need should address three broad areas. This is what we're looking for. First is the scope. So by scope, we mean the extent of the issue in your local community. What's the severity or the intensity of the need for those affected? For example, how many individuals or families are directly impacted by the need? And significance. This is the so what question. Why should we care about this particular need? So this includes data telling us how the need affects the community more generally and how this is connected to other community issues. Sharing data on trends or the likelihood that the need will worsen also really speaks to significance. And last is cause. It's helpful to know, like, why does the need exist? How did it come about? And historical data that shows how the need started and how long it's been around can be really helpful. So data on the scope and relevance pertain to describing the community need, and data on the cause of a problem can really help inform your choice of intervention or the service activity that you do. And we move to a word of caution here about really lengthy problem statements that outline every possible negative condition in your service area, even if it's not really related to your proposed intervention or outcome. So we don't want to know like all of the issues that are going on, all of the struggles that the community faces, but just the information specific to the intervention that you're proposing that's related to the outcome that you want to see. So do be specific, and don't just, we call it a data dump. Don't do a data dump where you're just dumping in all the data you can possibly find about an area. Okay, here's an example. We have EnviroCorps, who maintains trails throughout public parks in Iberia County. Many parks have deteriorating trails, and the lack of a maintained trail system leads to soil erosion and water runoff, polluting nearby streams. And hikers are more likely to not stay on the trails that aren't maintained, and they end up causing damage to fragile habitats. I think I have a typo on that slide there. So if you're looking at this program and and trying to write a problem statement and include relevant data, which data in the list below might be not so relevant? Poverty rates, yep. Yeah, that one definitely jumps out. Any others? I'm seeing one more that may be less relevant. Concentrations, water pollution concentrations. Um, it talks about water runoff polluting nearby streams. So having some data about the level of water pollution, I think could be helpful. The invasive species cover rates. Yeah, we don't really talk about invasives. They're in the example, they aren't, there's no mention of invasive species. It could be relevant, but based on what they've shared so far, it's less relevant than some of the other items. So that's great. Thank you so much for participating. And I see also in the chat, Nathan included peer-reviewed journal articles as a go-to source for evidence related to our earlier question. So thank you, Nathan. That's a great one. Especially if you're able to find those and access them. That's fantastic. Okay. And here, before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about equity and how the language that we use in how we communicate about our program and including in our grant application can have an impact, and just asking that we think through some of the common ways that we refer to things. So this is just some of what I've been learning as part of my equity journey. and realizing that some of the common terms that we hear and use in public and nonprofit agencies might need an update. So this, to be clear, this is not something that your application is scored on. We're not gonna um, be assigning points to this or anything. This is just simply because we at Serve Washington want to be more mindful about systems of oppression and how we describe the work that we do. So we wanted to include this as part of the presentation. So here are just some examples. At-risk youth, that's a really common term that we hear. And I have a link to where I got this information from on the slide about the opposite of deficit-based language isn't asset-based language, it's truth-telling. So it's about being clear with our language. So when considering some of these terms like at-risk youth, we can consider how this term positions some individuals and some communities even as centers of risk. But upon deeper examination, we see that the risks emanate more from things like criminalization, policing, or disenfranchisement. An underserved community is another common phrase, but it's a phrase that could position us as saviors, providing charity as the solution. The idea being that if we just provide more services, everything will be better. Um, but we don't want to ignore systemic oppression that might be going on. So here, I don't need to go over everyone. So here we're not suggesting using exclusively positive language either, which can have a similar kind of problem with feeding into the bootstraps narrative. So if everything is so great, then what's the problem? So we don't want to sugarcoat things. And as this article suggests, the way to avoid the problem of having the struggles of individual people or places represent something inherent and immutable is to explicitly point out the systems at work, past or present, that caused harm. So if you're talking about a problem, use language that reflects the systematic disparities and community-wide problems that have systemic causes. We can name that harm has been done and that these are not self-caused problems, and we can explicitly describe those systems whenever possible. So there, I have a couple more slides that explains this a little more. So this one kind of has some terms that we might want to replace with other language. But again, we note that language changes constantly, and some of this information might already be outdated. You might have heard other terms suggested, and this isn't like the better language isn't always like the way to go, but just it's something to consider and keep in mind. There are always nuances. For example, the term people with disabilities. Generally, people first language is preferred as it avoids defining a person in terms of their disability. However, some advocates prefer identity first language, and it's important to ask people about their preference in terminology. So, and just earlier, some months back, I was on another webinar that suggested not saying marginalized communities, but instead just simply naming the actual community. And to be clear, I'm bringing this up in relation to the theory of change in general and how we're discussing the problem, but specifically, I think it can come in related to answering that last part about cause. The question of why does the problem or need exist in the community, and how is it perpetuated? It considering the cause from an equity lens can really kind of point us back to these various systems of oppression. So the next slide just has an excerpt from the Equity Language Guide from the Governor's Interagency Council on Health Disparities. And we're including this just as an invitation to be explicit in your narrative about why the problem you're addressing exists in the first place. So as the quote says, state data have consistently pointed to differences in access and outcomes experienced by people of color. Examples include gaps in kindergarten readiness, disproportionality in the criminal justice system, disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards, and health inequities. When documenting these inequities, agencies, including the state of Washington, have historically used language that explicitly states or implies that it's someone's race or ethnicity that's a risk factor. But the council's guidance here to agencies is to actually be explicit about racism and other forms of oppression as the underlying cause for the inequities that exist and show up in government data. So such inequities might be due to overt interpersonal racism or institutional racism that exists in policies or processes that have disparate and adverse impacts on people of color. But when sharing information on outcomes by race or ethnicity, try to include context about the underlying reasons and ensure that it's relevant to your program. Maybe this isn't relevant to your program. It's up to you to decide. So this is just information if it's helpful for you. We, again, don't want this to become a data dump. So if it's not relevant, you don't have to include information about like a history of institutional racism if it's not related. All right. Well, thanks for hearing that piece. It really is important to us to be mindful of the language that we use and how we're thinking about our communities and the problems that exist. So now we can move to the intended outcome part of the theory of change. That is all about what change do you want your program to make. So after you have clearly identified the problem and need, the next step is to consider what's your desired result. So let's see, here are some examples of what an intended outcome might look like for an economic opportunity program. There are several possible outcomes you might measure, and there are 3 listed on the slide, but there are many others that we could come up with. So maybe your outcome is related to secured employment, or you want your participants to be transitioned into safe, healthy, affordable housing, or to demonstrate improved job readiness. And here, a word of caution. When choosing your outcome, caution against outcomes that are really difficult to measure or that don't align with the proposed intervention and need. So we really are looking for a very, very clear logical alignment. And we'll continue to talk about that alignment through this presentation and the next. Okay, and the other element is about your intervention. Once you know the change that you're hoping to make, then you can determine the most effective way to intervene. In your planning grant application, you were asked to describe the activities that you can see your AmeriCorps members engaging in and how that intervention could lead to positive changes. And here's your opportunity to revisit that and just really think through that choice. An intervention is the specific set of activities in which your participants and volunteers, if you recruit volunteers as well, will be engaged. It's the strategy you employ to bring about the change for those who will benefit from the services. So you approach this step with an understanding of the scope, significance, and cause of the problem at need, and an identified outcome or desired result. To determine what could be an effective intervention, you will look for evidence from performance measurement, evaluations, or research studies that show your proposed intervention is likely to achieve your intended outcome. What interventions have others tried? Have they proven successful? Or have they not led to the expected outcome? And I think this is where those peer-reviewed journal articles could be a great source. So here's an example of how evidence is useful when designing your intervention, or maybe you already have an intervention and you're needing to make some modifications to make it more effective. So if evidence from an evaluation shows that some specific number of hours of activity for teens led to improved physical condition and health, then you might consider having your intervention be a similar number of hours of activity if you're seeking to improve physical condition and health in teens that your program serves. So it's also important to note here that physical activity is a really broad category of intervention in the same way that antibiotics from our earlier example are a really broad category. Therefore, as you review evidence of what's worked, you really should pay attention to both the design of the intervention and the dosage received by the teens in the program that was studied. And for more detailed information on evidence, hold tight for that module coming up. Right. As part of your theory of change, you need to describe the intervention or service activities clearly. So you need to identify the design, which is defined as who does what with whom, as well as the dosage. And the dosage has 3 different elements. So the frequency, such as, for example, how many sessions a week, and the intensity, well, how long is each session, and then the duration, how many total weeks of sessions. So that's what we're looking for when you describe your intervention. We want to know both the design and the dosage. Here's an example, an intervention description for the after-school community-based run-up program. So the run-up curriculum serves small groups. Sorry, my notes are not matching the slide. So we'll go with the text on the slide. The run-up curriculum with youth ages 17 to 21 to increase physical fitness, 30 minutes per session, and educate them on body awareness. And they meet twice a week for 60 minutes per session for 12 weeks. So there's in the application itself, there aren't fields for frequency, intensity, duration, but when they ask for dosage, we are looking for that detailed information there. And a caution about intervention that's just defined in really general terms, but doesn't have a lot of detail or supportive evidence. So just as an example, we can look at this first intervention on this slide. Tutoring, structured physical activities, field trips, etc., 3 to 4 hours daily throughout the school year. So if you were reading this in a grant application, does it tell you everything you need to know about the design and the dosage. So the design is who does what with whom. Can we tell that from this intervention statement? No. No, we don't like who is receiving the tutoring, who's doing the tutoring, the structured physical activities. It's not clear. And what about the frequency? Any others in the chat? No. You know, we can, it says 3 to 4 hours daily, but it also lists a lot of activities. So it's not really clear what's being done and how frequently each of the things are being done. So it's kind of it's kind of gray there. It's not clear how the 3 to 4 hours a day is split between the various activities. All right, so let's go to the next slide where we've refined the intervention. So here's how we might update it so that now we can see the design and the dosage more specifically. So this one shows that it's AmeriCorps members who are providing teacher identified 3rd through 6th graders one-on-one tutoring at least 2 hours per week and structured small group physical activities for 1 to 2 hours after school each day throughout the school year. So that's the level of detail that we're looking for whenever you're describing your intervention. But after you've laid out all 3 elements of your theory of change, you would ask yourself the following questions. Is your theory of change plausible? If we do these things, will we get the results that we expect? Is it feasible? Do you have enough resources to implement the intervention you've chosen? And finally, is it meaningful? Are your intended outcomes important? Is the magnitude of the change you expect worth the effort that your members are going to put in? I'm seeing a question in the chat. Would it need to specify what the physical activities are? That's a great question. I think in your theory of change, in the full theory, you would probably have some detail about what that looks like. Yes, we would probably expect to see a little more detail about the specific physical activities. That's a good
Hey,
question,
hey,
Robin.
Lou, would it also, I'm just curious if you could give your kind of opinion on if we're talking about like social emotional and well-being of youth and it includes both tutoring and structured activities, is that a little different than if we're talking about a true like health and wellness phys ed program where the defined, intervention has evidence for a specific physical activity? Could it maybe be an and or either or thing?
Yeah, I think so. And it might, in some cases, it might even be two separate interventions. I think it could depend. Um, but if every person that you're working with is getting just sort of a very holistic, kind of varied approach, um, you could list the types of activities that the participants would receive and then include the dosage of how many hours per week for how many weeks. Um, but I think it is helpful to see just generally like what are the types of things that members are doing. Does that answer the question?
It did for me. We'll see if Jason has any follow-up, but yeah, I think anytime you can get as specific as possible. So if you specifically know that I can't even think of a specific activity, but if you're specifically training to, I don't know, build muscle, that physical activity might look a lot different than someone who's trying to fight fatigue or depression or something like that. So any specifics you can give us is always welcome.
Yeah, great. Okay. All right, now we are wrapping up with the theory of change. So just to summarize, um, the key points, having a well-conceived theory of change should really help identify the pathway that links your service activities to your intended outcome. And the three elements of a theory of change that we covered are the community problem, need, the intervention, and the intended outcome that's supported by evidence. We also have the data documenting the community need that should show the scope, significance, and causes. And do consider how you might apply an equity lens in communicating these aspects. And we commend those of you who have been doing this. We at Serve Washington really are continuing to learn. Now we have a 10-minute stretch break. We have a chair yoga, totally optional. We're just gonna put that on. And if you would like to participate as you're able or interested, feel free. It will be on. Maybe you just want to mute it and go take your own break. That's fine too. And we will come back. We really do have a lot to cover. So I'm going to say 11:08. Give us 10 minutes exactly. I'll put 11:08 in the chat. And Robin, can you
Yes,
play our?
I will get
Okay.
the optional yoga going here and see everyone back at 11:08.
And feel free to, again, like ask any questions, drop any questions in the chat, and we can start off with that when we return.
From a seated position, arch your spine and roll your shoulders down and back, bringing your chest forward and up. Bring your chin to your chest, bring that spine to the back of the chair for cat. Chest forward, arching the spine for cow pose. Bring the back of the spine towards your chair for cat. One last time for cow, and one last time for cat. Come back to center. Raise your arms out to the side of you. We're going to take our right hand and place it on our left knee. Left hand behind us, elongating the crown of the head towards the ceiling. We'll now take our left hand to our right knee for a nice side twist. Arms out to the center, right hand to left knee. If it feels comfortable to do so, look past your left shoulder. Being conscious of your spine. And now to the right. Notice your breath. One last time to our left side. Back to center. And to our right. Find yourself back in a seated center position. Inhale those arms up to the ceiling, clasp those hands as we lean to the left. a nice stretch on that side body. Coming back up to center, we now stretch to the right. Pay attention as you lean to the left of your right foot and right hip, anchor it into the chair. And notice the same for your left side. Left foot, left hip. Release your arms and do whatever last movements of the spine feel good to you as we transition to our lower legs. We'll place our heel down on the ground, toes towards the ceiling, moving the hands slowly down the leg for
I see it's 11:08. I hope everyone is back or returning shortly. In the interest of time and with all the content still left to cover, I say we go ahead and get back to it. Does that sound good with you, Robin?
Yep, go for it.
All right. We will move into the next module, which is about logic models. And we will you will see, if you don't already know, how this is connected to your theory of change. So we will cover that, and it really is intended to provide you with an understanding of how to develop a program logic model and also how to use it in ways that we hope are valuable to your program operations and that you can refer to as a tool when you're developing your performance measures and future program evaluation activities. So by the end of the presentation, we are hoping that you'll be able to describe what a logic model is and how to use it, identify the key components that make up a logic model, and that you will be able to develop a logic model for your program. That is something we will be looking for. And you will also be able to describe the relationship between logic models and evaluation planning, which we will get more into in 2 weeks. Okay, what is a logic model? I would wager that many of you are familiar and have created logic models before or have seen them. It really is a visual snapshot of your program, and it includes those elements from your theory of change. It communicates how your program works by depicting the relationships among the resources available to operate the program, the activities that your program carries out, and the changes or results that you hope to achieve that are called outputs and outcomes. So we'll be talking about each of these components. And do note that logic models come in many sizes and shapes and can vary in the level of detail. There's no one right way to do it, and it depends on your purpose, how you're going to use a logic model, and what your program is all about. So the 4 components outlined on this slide reflect a basic. I've added a 5th, the problem need, because that is something that we ask for in our logic models. And it reflects a simple logic model design that aligns with AmeriCorps' logic model guidelines. So this is the format that we use. And some of you might be familiar with other terms that are used interchangeably with logic models. Sometimes they can be called a causal chain or conceptual map, idea map, logical framework. But we call it a logic model with AmeriCorps, and use the terms that you see on the slide, which are the inputs or resources, activities, outputs, outcomes. Let's talk about each of those key components. So there, as I said, there will also be a column where you'll summarize your community problem need, and for whatever reason, a lot of AmeriCorps' materials on this training leave that part out, but just want to note that you should be familiar with it from your theory of change, and whenever you complete your logic model, there will be a column for you to just very succinctly, in just a couple sentences, summarize the community problem or need that your program is addressing. And then as you go along, starting on the left side of your logic model, there are the program's inputs, sometimes called resources. And they are the things that are essential for your program's activities to occur. It can include a combination of things. Some of the most common examples are funding, like your AmeriCorps grant, or other funds, your program staff, AmeriCorps members, volunteers, maybe specific curriculums that you follow, those sorts of things. Next is the activities component of your logic model. You can move to the next slide, and we have some examples there. These are the specific actions that make up your program or intervention, and they're reflecting the tools, processes, events, and other actions, your member interventions that are used to bring about your program's desired changes or results. So maybe you have workshops or counseling, you provide referrals and other resources. That's what would be captured under the activities column. And then we move to the outputs. And outputs are what a program's specific activities will create or produce. These are the things that provide evidence of service delivery. So they're often described numerically or quantified in some way. For example, outputs associated with the hypothetical nutrition assistance program might include the following. So you might have the number of individuals who attended a workshop, or the number of individuals who received food preparation services, or the specific number of individuals who received other referrals or resources. Next, we move to the outputs. From outputs, we move to outcomes. And outcomes are the specific changes that result from your program's activities or intervention. So it does align it with the outcomes in your theory of change. And here we are looking at a continuum of outcomes, ranging from short to long term. So short-term outcomes are often considered changes in beneficiaries' knowledge, skills, or attitudes. And they're the type of changes that we're looking for that can happen within a single year. And medium-term outcomes refer to changes in behavior or action that results from beneficiaries' new knowledge, skills, or attitudes. And longer-term outcomes are often characterized as changes in condition or status in life that result from these changes in behavior or actions. So it's important to think about that timeline, and we're really not looking for you to, the long-term outcome really could be sort of your pie in the sky hope that happens eventually. It's not something that you'll necessarily be tracking or measuring, but it's that long-term goal that you hope will occur as a result of your program. Okay, so now let's take a moment to highlight the differences between outputs and outcomes. They can be confusing sometimes. There's some gray area. I've seen some that are really hard to categorize, like, is that an output or an outcome? It's kind of in between. So to try to make it as clear as possible, on the left side of our slide, where we're describing the program outputs, these are the direct products of your program activities or services. And they really quantify what was delivered. And program outcomes, on the other hand, are describing the change that happened as a result of the activities or intervention. So outputs are essential elements that enable change, but they aren't representing or describing the benefits or the changes in and of themselves. And feel free to ask any questions. We can move into how to read a logic model. Now that we've covered those key components, typically logic models are read from left to right, and we use an if-then sequence from component to component. We have a generic example on the slide. So basically we would say if your program has these inputs or resources, then it can carry out these activities. And if your program carries out these activities, then it can produce these outputs. If your program has produced these outputs, then it will achieve these outcomes. So there are two sides of the logic model: the process side, which is about the implementation or planned work. That includes the inputs, resources, activities, and outputs. And then there's the outcome side of the logic model, which describes those changes that you're hoping that your program can accomplish. And they're the short, medium, and long-term changes. So let's discuss a little more about creating a logic model. We talked about how to read one, and there are two approaches that are used to create a logic model. There's the forward logic, like we just talked about, or maybe you want to work backwards. Maybe you know, like, okay, this is the end goal, like this is what we want to accomplish. And so you want to go the other way, and you can do that too. So let's talk about that. So the forward logic approach starts with your program's inputs and activities and uses that progressive series of if-then statements to establish relationships between each of those columns. So we could use this nutrition assistance program, or a nutrition assistance program as an example. So in that case, if we have access to AmeriCorps members, then we can provide food education workshops and referral services. If we carry out these activities, then we will deliver services to 200 families. If families receive these services, then they will learn about healthy food choices and improve their skills in preparing nutrient-dense meals. If families gain this knowledge and acquire these skills, then they will adopt these new food practices. If families adopt these new food practices, then their risk for certain health conditions will decrease. Reverse logic goes, but how? So you would work backwards, and you can start on the right side of the logic model with the desired outcome and go to the left in order to identify the activities and inputs that might make the most sense. So the reverse logic approach is often used in the development or planning stages of a program because it can ensure that the program activities will logically lead to those specific outcomes. So you ask, but how, as you move from right to left. So maybe your goal is to decrease the risk for certain health conditions. So you would ask, but how? Well, we want families to adopt new food practices. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to ensure that they have a certain skill set and a certain knowledge and understanding. But how will you do that? And you just keep working your way left. So regardless of which way you go, if you're doing the if then or the but how, it should enable you to uncover gaps in your logic, clarify assumptions, and better understand how investments and your program's activities are likely to produce the intended results and outcomes. Okay, so now we have an interactive activity, and I'm hoping everyone will participate. We can make this really simple. Robin is going to be our scribe, and we're going to work on building a logic model together as a group. So I hope everyone is ready to go. And we can apply the forward logic approach. So the if then, we would go left to right, and use a hypothetical wildlife conservation program. We have a really brief description here, but basically, you know, we get to make it up as we go along. So say we have a wildlife conservation program, and it's designed to create healthy, productive, and sustainable ecosystems for the benefit of wildlife. So we're looking for wildlife with healthy, productive, and sustainable ecosystems. Great, thank you, Robin. You put that in the chat so we can refer to it. Okay, so, and this is where it could really be helpful to come off mute, not required, but feel free to just blurt out ideas, or you're also welcome to use the chat. So what would be just a quick one sentence? What do you think is a potential problem that this program is addressing?
So this is Nate, and I would say, you know, wildlife habitat in our region is degraded.
Perfect. Yep, I think we can leave it as simple as that. And so let's move to inputs. What are some of the resources that would probably be necessary for this program? I'm assuming it's probably an AmeriCorps program, so.
Yeah, I was gonna say the number of participants needed.
Yeah, that'd be a great place to start.
You might call them like 10 AmeriCorps, you know, restoration technicians or something like that.
Okay, like
You know, the
members
member,
and staff.
member restoration. Yeah, they're members, of course, but they're
Okay.
um,
Yeah, so maybe that's also like specific training that they have.
mhm.
Perfect. Yeah, I think this all fits. We're getting the hang of it. These are the types of things we would put there. So let's move to the next column, the activities. If our goal is to have healthy, productive, sustainable ecosystems, what are some of the activities that this program might do?
Maybe litter collection.
Yeah, perfect.
Revegetation projects.
Awesome. Totally.
You could for dosage, you could specify, you know, the number of hours, but maybe acres or hectares or, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
If you have them running any tests.
Monitoring.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Testing, monitoring.
Where
Cool.
does I got a question? Where does public education come into this model? Because that one of the critical activities here is that you got to engage the public, and that's an educational. I'm not getting to the level of. You might even just put down workshops, and public workshops might be one that would be part of would be an activity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that could go in the activities column. So then if this program does these activities, then what are some of the outputs they might expect to see?
Increased number of birds. That's a simple example.
Yep. Yeah, I would say that's a great change that we would expect. That I think we could move that to the outcome, the next outcome column. And that would be something we would expect
Oh, output. Sorry.
expect to see. Yeah, no, that's great. We will record it there. And
Pounds or number of bags collected.
yeah. Yeah, we could even go just like the
Would this be where you put, number of trees planted
sure.
as
Yep,
an output? Yeah.
exactly. So what would be for the testing
People that
or sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say number of people that attended workshops.
Yep. Yeah.
And then for the testing monitoring one, it would be direct correlation of what your results from this test were, hopefully improving.
Could you say a little more about that, or let's think through that one? Like the direct product of the testing or monitoring. How would we kind
Well,
of count that?
God. I mean, one of the things in monitoring is you develop baseline data or change over time
Okay.
as an output, because we're going to monitor a site. We're going to know what soil acidity might be, for instance, or pH in water would be, or temperature, air temperature. I mean, any number of data collection, right? And so that an output from this would be baseline if you don't have it, or you've already gathered that baseline. So therefore, the next thing you're looking at is change over time. If I'm collecting data during the project, that's one of the outcomes, though. I think one of the outcomes is a data model that shows change over time. Basically, we should see a decrease in ambient temperature after planting X number of trees over X number of years, right?
Okay. Great. Yep. Thanks, Robin. Robin's capturing that. So yeah, we could count the number of sites monitored, or like the number of sites where we have baseline data now.
Yeah.
And then the change, maybe we would be able to capture these changes in temperature, soil condition. All right, so I think we are good to move on to the outcomes.
On something like that, would the decrease in temp soil conditions, since you're noticing it over time, would it actually fall under each of those three?
That's a good question.
Good question. Yeah.
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 Yeah, if it's right, okay, Robin's got it.
Thanks.
We could
Okay.
be, yeah,
So
tracking
then you
them.
just specify the time frame in
Yeah.
each one, if it's something that you're going to be tracking throughout the whole time.
When I've seen conditions as the only change element, which does pertain to quite a few environmental programs, and we have quite a few environmental planning grants, Lou. We do usually see conditional changes that may be similar, but then as you have all assessed, you really do have to associate some type of time frame. And so our short-term outcomes based on AmeriCorps standards are always during the grant year. So we have to usually have something, and this gets kind of forward thinking into performance measures, but we have to have something that we can usually measure in year one. And then midterm and long term are things that may not result in actual measurements, but maybe something that's evaluative in nature. I don't know. I'm probably getting ahead a little bit, Lou.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah. I've got a question related to that, which is member pre and post survey. So that one change that we want to achieve in both the short term, mid, and long term is that through the education and work experience, the members, the AmeriCorps members, will start with perhaps no knowledge about environmental restoration. And so the problem is lack of environmental restoration techniques, or the lack of marine restoration techniques. And the input is training, and the activity is field, and the output is those outputs. But the short-term outcome for the member is that he or she now has baseline knowledge to restoration skills. And
Yeah.
you look, so I'm not sure where that fits into this overall model, but we're talking about the resource here, but the parallel to that is the AmeriCorps member and the journey that he or she goes through.
Yeah, we definitely see programs that include that as part of their logic model, that maybe certain changes that they expect to see in their members, and that is something that's very important to the program, and they include that as an item in the logic model. So you could totally have something related to that.
Okay.
Hey, Lou, is it fair these last couple that when you are kind of jumping, as I think Don and some people are talking about, when you're jumping to baseline data and then change and conditional change over time, the output seems fairly simplistic, and I think that's what kind of throws people off, is that the output is really just the number of sites then that you're monitoring, and then like the number of individuals you tested for like a knowledge gain, and then it's the short term, did they increase by some type of scale, knowledge from pre to post. Is that kind of fair, Lou, how that output can be like overly simplistic, like it's just the bean counting, the output
Right.
is really just the bean counting?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Totally.
And we're not getting very detailed. You're all obviously grasping the concept well, but we would expect to see, these actual numbers filled in. We would expect to see, like, how are you going to measure that increase on the test? Like, do they have to score a certain amount or improve by a certain amount? So those are other details that I think, Lou, that probably comes later as well, huh?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We'll talk about that, about how this relates to your performance measures, but also how you don't have to measure everything in your logic model. We'll definitely get into that more later. And I am seeing the time, so I'm wondering if maybe we should wrap this up. I do feel like people got it. I'm excited, and I think some of you are familiar with like the environmental focus area. So that was a good choice. I think it was AmeriCorps' choice of focus area for that exercise. So great. So as you create your logic model for your program, and maybe you've already got one that you're gonna just maybe revisit, and I encourage you to consider these questions. These are the items. I think they're actually listed in the logic model module. So it will help guide how you complete it. So just consider those questions about as you're thinking through the modeling process for each component. And then after you create your logic model, you'll verify by asking these kind of questions about the appropriate level of detail. Is it plausible? Is it realistic? Is there consensus among key stakeholders that the model accurately represents your program? It's always a good idea to have multiple people look at it, make sure that it makes sense to them and reflects their understanding of your program. So in particular, does it have the appropriate detail? And are all of the relationships really plausible, or did you leave something out? Is it realistic? And note, as I think I mentioned earlier, that some of the longer term outcomes, though we asked you to identify them, it might not be feasible for you to measure them or measure the cause and effect relationship between your intervention and those longer term outcomes. And that's okay, but just ask yourself whether it's reasonable to assume that your program could achieve that, and that it logically makes sense. And if there's consensus among stakeholders that the model does accurately depict your program. Okay, any questions before we move on? We will, here's just a few final highlights about logic model. It's really normal for it to take multiple sessions. There's not one right way, and it really represents your intention that reflects your planned activities and outcomes and should be supported by your theory of change. And it's not a static document. We would expect it to grow and evolve as your program does. And you don't need to evaluate every aspect of your logic model. But it is a great tool for informing any future evaluation that you might do and building your evidence for your program. So there are a couple other resources if you want to read more about logic models. There's some I've included on these slides that I believe you'll have access to, or at least the recording if you want to refer back to it. There are so many. You could Google it, find whatever is your favorite. Many resources. Okay, so our third and final module that we're going to cover is about building evidence of effectiveness. And so this is specifically related to helping you select an effective intervention. And we're going to talk about how evidence supports your theory of change in your program design, and learn about different types of evidence and some considerations for assessing evidence from your own program or similar programs. This really is an introductory course, and again, all of these modules are on the Litmos site on AmeriCorps. All right, so here just a refresher. I know you saw these slides earlier, but when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about that dark blue box bottom right that is related to the information that you're going to seek that's going to help you decide which intervention you're going to provide, and supports that cause and effect relationship between the intervention and the outcome. So in the context of our work, evidence is the information or facts that are systematically obtained in a manner that's replicable, observable, credible, and verifiable for use in making judgments or decisions. So it's the result of rigorous data collection and research. If you're starting a new program, evidence provides a sound basis to choose an intervention to meet a specific community need. Once you know what community problem you're addressing and what change you intend to make, then evidence will help you determine the best intervention to use to make it happen. And if you're already operating a program, evidence helps you understand whether your intervention is producing the intended outcomes or not. So for new programs, evidence shapes the program design in different ways at different stages. So when you're new, evidence can help you to choose an appropriate intervention and an appropriate dosage. So the frequency, intensity, and duration that will help you achieve your intended outcome. And in looking at what interventions have been successful, you might choose to replicate an existing model or implement best practices from a successful program. You might also look at how and why existing interventions have fallen short and design a program to overcome some of those pitfalls. It's important for existing programs to use evidence to continuously improve your program model. And as you measure your performance, as you evaluate your program over time, you might find that some pieces of your intervention are more effective than others, and maybe you want to adjust the design of your intervention accordingly. And if you find that your program is not achieving the outcomes you expected, maybe it makes sense to choose an entirely different intervention. So with many program designs, AmeriCorps considers the most rigorous type of evidence to come from evaluations with a comparison group or a control group. So these types of evaluations are known as quasi-experimental designs or experimental designs. Just like in medicine, comparing outcomes for both individuals that don't receive an intervention with individuals who do enables researchers to establish whether there's a cause and effect relationship between the intervention and outcome. So as we talked about today with the theory of change, it's really about that cause and effect relationship between your intervention and outcome. So rigorous evaluation designs test that theory. When experimental or quasi-experimental evaluations have established that there is a cause and effect relationship between a program's intervention and outcomes, the program is said to be evidence-based. But note that those kinds of evaluation designs, the experimental designs, are can be very expensive, and they are not required of all programs, only those who receive more than 500,000 on the AmeriCorps share. And they're not appropriate for every program design. So just kind of a little more information there. And here is AmeriCorps' evidence continuum. I know the text on this slide at the bottom is super small. So I apologize for that. I do blame AmeriCorps for that text. It's from one of their slides, but the more important part are the I guess kind of maroon magenta boxes, and how you can see that these are steps where you can move from one to the other. But even though it is set up as a step, the process of building evidence really isn't always linear. It doesn't always go in the direction of the arrow. Findings at any stage might result in program design changes and could cause a program to return to earlier steps. For example, maybe a program isn't meeting its performance measure outcomes, so step 3, and might decide to go back to the drawing board and look at evidence for other interventions. This may also go back to this program might also go back to step 2 to determine if some aspect of the program is being implemented correctly or not. So evidence at all stages of this continuum are really valuable, and positive findings at any stage help to build your program's overall evidence base. AmeriCorps funds programs at all stages of the continuum, but ultimately they encourage programs to seek to strengthen their evidence and improve their program model over time. So now that we've discussed how programs build evidence over time, let's talk about how to find and evaluate evidence to support your theory of change. So common sources are things like evaluations of similar programs. A lot of times programs do rely on evidence from other programs who maybe have been around longer, maybe another program that is large, has lots of funding, and is able to do those very expensive evaluations. So we can look to see what are they finding, what are they doing, and how's that working. You could also use performance measurement data from your program. So that just the tracking outcomes of your own program to see, are you reaching those outcomes that you thought you were going to reach? That can help you build evidence for your program. And maybe you do eventually do an evaluation of your program outcomes. And depending on the type of evaluation that you conduct, you could use this type of evidence to move along that continuum. So let's talk about some sources. So the first source is evaluation results from other programs. But here, a word of caution. I don't have one of those little caution signs, but whenever you're assessing how applicable the evidence is from another program to your program, the program should be as similar as possible in the design and the dosage, to be able to show that this is really relevant. And maybe if other programs have successfully done what you want to do, you might consider replicating all or part of these models into your own model. We'll talk a little more about that. Another source of evidence is your own past performance measurement data on outcomes. Past outcome findings from performance measurement don't demonstrate causation, but they do provide data about whether or not a change occurred. And so they can't prove that the change occurred because of your intervention, but it's still useful to show that ultimately the intended result was achieved. And if you're looking at your past performance data as evidence for an intervention, consider, what do your data tell you? Did you achieve your intended outcome? Do you have multiple years of outcome data that you can aggregate? Using data from multiple years does make a stronger case for the effectiveness of your intervention. So if you have it, do use it. Another source of evidence can be the results of an evaluation of your program outcomes. This could range from an evaluation that looks at change in beneficiaries over time to an evaluation with a comparison group that looks at whether there's a causal link between the program activities and outcomes. So some key questions to ask are, what type of evaluation is it? Did the evaluation look at outcomes? Sometimes evaluations are what we call process evaluations that look at how your program was implemented, which can be very helpful, but they don't assess outcomes or causation and don't provide evidence that supports the effectiveness of your program. Does the evaluation document changes in beneficiaries' knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition? If your program didn't meet the outcomes as expected, what have you learned and what changes are you making to improve? Does the evaluation show that your intervention is what caused the change? Not all outcome evaluations are able to demonstrate causation. I am also noticing the time and that we are we're very close to 12, so I'm gonna try to be, we do just have like a couple more slides, but I'm gonna go a little quick here because I know Robin also has some wrap up at the end. So when you are assessing evidence, there are several factors to look at. If you are looking at evidence from another program, look to see how similar it is to yours, whether the findings were significant or not. And we are looking for it to be as up to date as possible, the most recent available. And high quality, of course. If the evaluation or the performance measurement tracking was well implemented, and if it was an evaluation, if it has appropriate research methodologies, and is it reputable? So we're looking for, like peer reviewed, and by a credible organization. So here's a little bit about how AmeriCorps is looking at evidence and the sort of categories they're using, from preliminary to moderate, and then strong. And the moderate and strong categories really are those that include those experimental or quasi-experimental evaluation designs. So those are the ones that can move a program into the moderate or strong category. And what the preliminary are those like maybe you're a new program or you're a smaller program, totally fine. And you have some data from your own program, maybe some outcome data or information that you've been able to find of a similar program, but maybe not exactly your same program design. So that's just a little about how AmeriCorps is categorizing evidence. And here we are just going to show a little bit about searching online. So AmeriCorps does have a repository with program evaluations posted, and it can be a really helpful resource. You can check that out. That's the first link there, the AmeriCorps Evidence Exchange. Google Scholar is a great one if you're wanting to find just some peer-reviewed journal articles, that sort of thing. There are other kind of clearinghouses specific to different focus areas like education. I know there are a number of them. I put one up there that's specific to education. And I'm sure, if you have others, again, feel free to share those in the chat. But we can go ahead and wrap up. In summary, evidence enables us to determine whether or not a program is achieving its intended outcomes, and your theory of change should be informed by the type of evidence that we just covered here, as much as you're able to show what intervention is likely to be successful. There's many different types of evidence, and each with unique value and limitations, and many factors to consider when assessing evidence. Again, more detail on the slide. And finally, we can, these modules in full can be found on the AmeriCorps online courses.litmus.com, and you can create an account. And we'll turn it over to Robin for the last few minutes. So sorry, Robin, that I didn't give you very much time.
No worries, that's great. We totally understand if people need to hop off. We're just going to finish our last few slides and the recording will be full. And you can come back to us at a different time if that works better. That link is not always a super friendly link, but as Lou said earlier in the presentation, everyone is eligible to develop an account which will get you into these full libraries of various sessions. And it just is something that you have to request. So for a new account, as you can kind of see here, you just simply email serviceresources@cns.gov. Let them know you're a planning grant with Washington and you'd like access to the litmus system, and you should at that point be given uh, the ability to log in, and then you just come back and enter your username and password. We all know how to do that, right? When you forget something, you got to re-go through everything. So that is that. We'll go back to the slides just for a couple of minutes. Your homework is now kind of really kicking into gear. So for those of you that are kind of the primary people working on the planning grant, we know this was a lot of information today. Our curriculum is really built for the most content up front. So these first few webinars are going to be pretty heavy. They're definitely going to take all of our time together, and you will begin to see as the period goes on the webinars decrease in content, decrease in time, and even closer to the end, you won't be receiving much new content at all. So we pack it up front so you have a lot of time to be working on all of your pieces. So you're going to begin developing your own theory of change and logic model, and maybe identify some evidence to support that theory of change framework. And to do that, we will be giving you templates. You can use our templates, or you are more than welcome to use something on your own. A lot of folks already have something maybe that their organization prefers, or a different way of thinking through things. So our templates are meant to be helpful. They are not necessarily the only way to do things. And those will be posted with this information on your planning grant website. We would like to see, your first version here in the next couple of months. So through the end of February, if you send your theory of change and logic models to Lou and I, we will do some internal collaboration and get you some feedback. And we put that time frame around just to help sure that we all stay on track together and are moving through this 6 months on the same pace. Of course, you're going to continue to discuss and assess these types of things through the life of a grant. You may be ready to apply sooner than later. You may not be. These things definitely go through an evolution. Quick question I see I missed regarding the litmus system, the training library for AmeriCorps. It is per person as far as access goes. So I do not believe it's an organizational account. I think anyone that wants access would need to set up their own username and password and login. Good question. You will find that a lot of what AmeriCorps does is based on the individual, including e-grants and some other things that you will learn along the way. So with that, we're not too bad, 12:01. Nice job, Lou. Really appreciate. Oh, and thank you, yeah, Jason, for putting in that additional email address to get your account started. I will hang about, Lou will hang about, and we will answer questions, and hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day.